muffin here. Going to be doing a video subscriber request on penetration for high explosive rounds. Now, this is going to be from tiers 1 through 10, doing all the tanks and splitting them up in categories with light, medium, heavy tank destroyers, because as your mediums fight mediums, sometimes as they're on the flank, heavies are facing heavies and side scraping situations in town. So I wanted to divide this up, and this is to go over the entire list once again, ranking these tanks from best penetration with HE or the worst. And so now some tanks don't have HE shells, so I'm excluding those ones, but HE adds an entirely different world to the game. It really changes things up. And you may be asking, well, why do this video? Well, if you can penetrate one of your shots, if your penetration is one of the best, that increases your chances of being able to get that HE round, that high explosive round to penetrate. And if you can do so, it ends up doing a lot more damage. If it just explodes on the surface without penetrating, you could do some splash damage, but that could be a real game changer. It is an entirely different aspect. It really adds to the game. And so you want to be able to pay attention for those, and you can tell if you can pen or not when you're looking at a tank. Kind of like when you do with a standard round, you can see what's red, areas of the tank that has that shadow red on it where you can't pen, where it's not showing that where you can. HE works where if you see kind of that shadow of yellow over areas, that's where you cannot pen with that high explosive round. And then where it's not, you can pen. And like I said, if you can penetrate, the HE round can do a lot more damage. And so some of these tanks have high penetrating, high explosive rounds, and I'm including that penetration value in there so that as you're coming across these tanks, just in general, you know what these tanks are capable with. Even though some of the times those high penetrating, high explosive rounds do cost more credits and so forth. So just to kind of clear the slate, just let you know what this video is about and going right in. So with starting off at tier 1, now there was only 3 tanks that actually had high explosive shells, but they're no longer in the game. That was the Vickers Medium Mark 1, the classic MS1, we miss, RIP, and the Mark 1 heavy tank, which was an event tank. So not really going over anything here from tier 1. These tanks aren't even in the game anymore. So no really point in ranking anything from tier 1. Tier 2 actually has no tanks that use high explosive rounds. So there's, once again, nothing to really go over here. You don't have to worry about facing tier 2 with high explosive. Going into tier 3, now only 3 tanks have high explosive rounds at this tier, and they're either collectors, premium, that's actually no longer in the game. Wargaming has said they'll no longer sell. It was in the store a long time ago, but it's the Kennyotsu, which has 18 millimeters of penetration, the BT7, which actually has the best penetration for a high explosive shell at 38 millimeters, or also the T82 American TD at 20 millimeters of high explosive penetration. So those are the only tanks in tier 3. If you do come across those, maybe watch out, because if they do pen you with those high explosives, they can do a little bit more damage than their standard round in the game. Going into tier 4, looking at, now this is where we actually get into the category breakup. This is where you actually start seeing high explosives being much more common. So for the best penetrating high explosive shell tanks, now once again, just to clarify, this is just going off of the most commonly used cannon in the game. There's a lot of things that change the aspect, and once again, this is not going off of the calibrated shells enhancement. This is just going off the gun rammer. So and the most commonly used cannons in the game, there are some things that do change those variables. So once again, most commonly used cannons with gun rammer, if you use calibrated shells equipped with your tank, that can increase the penetration value of some of these numbers. So just keep that in mind as well. So once again, for tier 4, the light and medium tank with the highest and best penetrating for a high explosive shell is the A20 at 39 millimeters of pen. For the heavy tank with the best high explosive penetration is the Durchbreckenwagen 2 at 38 millimeters of penetration. Even though there's only two heavy tanks with high explosives, and the tank destroyer with the best high explosive penetrating rounds is the Electo and the Su-85B at 44 millimeters. So going into the tanks with the worst high explosive shell penetrating rounds for light and medium is the Covenanter, the Valentine 2, the AC-1 Sentinel at 12 millimeters of penetration. The heavy with the worst is the B1 at 24 millimeters, and the tank destroyer is between a couple, the Hetzer Chemie SP and the T40 at 20 millimeters. Going into tier 5, the tanks, the light and medium with the best high explosive pen is the T34 at 39 millimeters of pen. For the heavy, it's the BDR G1B with 45 millimeters of pen. And for the tank destroyer, it's actually the Nightmare with 53 millimeters of pen. For the tanks with the worst high explosive penetrating rounds, for light and medium tanks, it's the VK 16.02 Leopard and the Cruiser with 15 millimeters. For the heavy tank, it's also across a few, the VK 30.01H, the T14, the KV220 beta test, and the Churchill 3, all with 20 millimeters of pen. And for the tank destroyer with the worst is the AT2 with 15 millimeters. Going into tier 6, the tanks with the best high explosive penetrating rounds for light and medium tanks is between the P43 bis and the P4306 bis Anniversario with 45 millimeters of penetration. For the heavy tank, it's actually the KV2 with 76 millimeters of penetration. And for the tank destroyer, it's the SU-100Y with 65 millimeters of penetration. So when you're playing these tanks and you're one of the tanks that has some of the best penetration for high explosive shells, you may want to test it out, try it out, see if you can actually pen some of these, because you could actually be doing a lot more damage. And if you're some of the worst, maybe your chances of switching to that high explosive round to test things out maybe is not as great. But only to focus on those really, really thin armored tanks or just the rear of tanks. And then the worst high explosive penetrating rounds for the tanks for light and medium was the Type 64, the M24 Chaffee, the T21, the VK 30.01D, the VK 30.02M, the Schmaltrum, or the Star Chaser, known in the game, the Firefly Saunders SP, the Sherman Firefly, the Fury, and Loza's M4A2 Sherman. They all have a high penetrating round penetration of 20 millimeters. So those are the worst. It almost kind of sounded like I was going through all of the tier 6 light medium tanks, but definitely there's more in there. And then the heavies with the worst high explosive pen was the Churchill 7 and the TOG 2 with 20 millimeters of pen. And the tank destroyer with the worst high explosive penetrating rounds was actually the AT8 with 20 millimeters. Now going into tier 7, the tanks with the best for light and medium, which actually the one that ranked the best isn't in the game anymore. It was actually an event tank. It was the T49 ATM, and that thing actually had 85 millimeters of high explosive pen. Once again, isn't in the game. It was an event, but the one currently in the game with the best penetration is the T34-1 with 50 millimeters of pen. For the heavy, This doesn't quite surprise me. It's the Smasher with 85 millimeters of pen. And for the tank destroyer, it's the Vindicator at 80 millimeters of pen. Now, going into the tanks with the worst high explosive pen for tier 7, at light and medium is the Panther 1, the Panther M10, and the Comet at 20 millimeters. For the heavy tanks, it's the Gravedigger, the Black Prince, the FE215 A45 with 20 millimeters of pen. And for the tank destroyers, it was the E25 and the AT-15A with also 20 millimeters of penetration. So the worst for tier 7 across the board was just the 20 millimeters for all those categories. Going into tier 8, the light and mediums with the best high explosive was the RU-251 and the German M41 90 millimeter at 102 millimeters of high explosive pen. For the heavy tanks, it was actually the IS-3 and the Object 252U with 68 millimeters of pen. And for the tank destroyer with the best, it was the Charioteer with 175 millimeters of pen. For the worst, for light and medium, it was between a few as well. The FE301, the Centurion Mark I, the Defender Mark I, and the Centurion Mark 5.1 at 42 millimeters of penetration. For the heavy tanks, it was the Carnovion and the Action X at 42 millimeters. And for the tank destroyer with the worst, it was the AT-15 with 42 millimeters. Going into tier 9, the light and mediums with the best was the Centurion Mark 7.1 with 210 millimeters of penetration, with that high penetrating, high explosive round. There was also kind of some of those throughout the other ones as well. And then for the best heavy, with the best high explosive pen is the Conqueror with 120 millimeters of pen. And the tank destroyer with the best pen for high explosive was the Conway at 200 millimeters, also with that high penetrating, high explosive round. And then the worst was for light and medium was the Batchat 25 TAP, the AMX 30 Prote, the T55A, and the T54, all with 50 millimeters of pen. The heavy tank with the worst high explosive pen was actually the K91 with also 50 millimeters of pen. And then for the tank destroyers with the worst was actually between the Foch and the Jagdtiger, or the Foch and the Jagdtiger with 65 millimeters of pen. Now, lastly, going into tier 10, the light and medium tanks with the best high explosive penetrating round is the FE4202 with 210 millimeters of penetration, using also that high penetrating HE round. For the heavy tank with the best was the FE215B at 120 millimeters. And for the tank destroyer, no surprise here, was the FE215B 183 or the Death Star with 220 millimeters of penetration. And for the worst, for light and medium tanks, was between the T62A, the Object 140, and the T22 medium with a high penetrating or the high explosive penetration of 50 millimeters. And for the heavy tanks, it's going to be the soon-to-be Kranwagen, the T11OE5, the T57 Heavy, and the T95E6, all with only 60 millimeters of penetration for their high explosive rounds. And for the tank destroyers, it's actually the FV217 Badger and the FV4005, both with a penetrating high explosive round of 65 millimeters. So hopefully this was helpful as you're playing the game and you are, once again, are those tanks that rank some of the best highest penetration for high explosive, maybe take a look. Try it out, see what you can do, because you could do a lot more damage and wreak havoc with those high explosive rounds. And if maybe you're one of those tanks on the lower end, maybe it may be something like you may not use quite as much, maybe save you like a second or so from changing rounds, or even use only at the rear of tanks or so. But let me know how this changes your guys' thoughts in the game. This is the Muffin here. Hopefully this was helpful. Stay cool and keep tanking.